Indeed, and it's a real pleasure to be here today and to share with you some of our experiences in the West Midlands. I am here today not only as somebody who's worked in academia for the last 10 years, but as a mayoral candidate for the West Midlands. And it was immediately apparent to me that we need to link together our region, because we're not just a city, we're a city region far more effectively. And my think tank at Birmingham City University has really been doing this, and I was tremendously interested to hear Simeon from the World Bank earlier, because we're looking at how can we actually measure the quality and the strength of the external linkages across the West Midlands. What we've started to do, first of all, I worked with about 51 organisations in pulling this short study together. We looked at 3 sectors: transport, construction and energy, because the businesses I was working with had a vision about the West Midlands becoming the sustainable heart for transport and the built environment in the West Midlands. It's a great manufacturing area. 30% of our GVA comes from manufacturing when you take into account secondary impacts. We felt these were areas that we could really excel in and were already excelling in. But our businesses were really concerned because Indigenous homegrown business was, in their view, always overlooked in favour of the FDI, the foreign investment, which attracted a lot of attention and money. And this is a picture of the businesses across the West Midlands according to NOMIS. In fact, it depends on what data you look at as to how many businesses we have in the West Midlands. House of Commons suggests we have 413,000, so there is a bit of a difference here. We think 82,000. But actually, when you look at the really important medium-sized businesses, the ones that can scale up, we only have 350 of these. So we could literally get to know every single one of these businesses and what is happening to them and how we can support them. And when we started to ask the companies, what is your culture? It turned out that the majority of companies, 30% in this sample, had engineering-led cultures. So maybe they felt themselves there was more they should be doing to perhaps be more outward looking, to attract more talent. And the way they felt they could do that was by being more design-led, more brand-led, and they felt that would be more welcoming, particularly to young female employees, young female talent internationally. The other interesting thing was that we were really focused on how could we source onshore more, because our supply chains are increasingly complicated in manufacturing. And even though the majority of them, well over half, felt there was a very strong opportunity to onshore, actually the level of new entrants into their supply chain was exceptionally low. So something wasn't connecting there. And then when we looked at the startup activity, actually there was a very small amount. In fact, as you can see here, over 60% of very little startup activity was being quoted. And when we look at the numbers, actually we have about a third of the startups of London in the West Midlands, and 70% of those are likely to die, compared to in London, maybe there's a 60% death rate compared to startups. And when we looked at other elements of the ecosystem, public procurement was only actually supporting 30% of the sample. Public procurement was considered way overly complex, and yet most of the companies met the required criteria for public procurement. So it seemed that the public sector wasn't thinking about procuring locally or acting on that. Skills shortages, thinking about some of the points that Gordon was making about talent availability locally, was particularly worrying. 30% of the businesses couldn't access the talent that they need, and the talent they needed was technicians, design engineers, production engineers. And that's right now, 36% couldn't fulfill needs that they had right now in these areas. But when you looked at future skills shortages, the picture simply got worse. So it seemed that the links between the talent supply in terms of our universities and colleges into our businesses and our business needs are simply not sufficiently strong enough. And companies felt the dialogue between the training organisations and the companies was too weak. So, and had they used business support, this was a critical area. 50% had never used business support of any kind. But when asked, was it appropriate and how easy was it to access finance for their businesses, around 50% said it was actually very difficult to access finance for their businesses. Where were they investing? You won't be surprised to see people skills, new tech, digital ICT. So there was a lot of investment going on. But in terms of barriers to growth, thinking about our ecosystem in the West Midlands and how we were measuring that, access to skills was a barrier for 60% of the businesses. Economic uncertainty, I have to say, brought about largely as a result of Brexit in their minds, was the second highest barrier. But interestingly, and in my experience of working in the West Midlands for 22 years, business support came out as the third highest barrier to growth. Access to business support and the strength of that ecosystem cited as the third highest barrier. I'd never seen that in 22 years. And in terms of Brexit, threat or opportunity, a very high threat, or quoted as a high threat by almost 50% of the businesses, and with considerable investment now starting to go offshore straight away, because 30% of our manufacturing is in automotive. So I think for our new mayor, who's just been elected, the opportunity to actually link together our ecosystem, that we look at the internal operation of most of our businesses to drive productivity. I think the businesses would say, actually, the opportunity for increasing productivity is far more in the external linking in our ecosystem. So thank you very much.
Beverley, thank you very much. And of course it links in with what Gordon was saying earlier, how important it is to get the backing and the commitment of the mayor or whatever it is that various cities have, which again was a point made by Sonia. But it's interesting also to see that there are problems of the type that Athens has, which are felt by every sort of city around the world which is trying to be competitive.
I think if I may just add, one of the real factors that we particularly found in the West Midlands was that there'd been years of underinvestment in infrastructure. We had a third of the investment in infrastructure per head compared to London, but we took, the majority of the road transport, 80% of the rail transport for the country, and we'd had a seventh of the public transport investment of London. So I think for regions like the West Midlands, English regions like the West Midlands, getting a fair settlement is really critical to boosting our productivity.
Well, I mean, the money that goes into infrastructure is seriously important. I mean, Athens benefited hugely from the Olympics and the infrastructure spending there. I mean, it did wonders to congestion when the metro was built and the periphery all around Athens, but there's been hardly anything since. And it's interesting again that transport was mentioned, of course, by Gordon very, very significantly, and also, of course, by Sonia about Lille. I have to admit, we're not as central to Europe physically as Lille is, I'm afraid. But there are still, yes. So now to turn to Toby. I did relax the timing, but nevertheless, 5 to 7 minutes, I think, is what we're going to do. I mean, Toby is an entrepreneur. He's been an academic. He's been advisor to the UK government, and also has worked with the Soros Foundation. And very interestingly, he's been advisor to the Estonian government. So perhaps there's some lessons from there.
Yeah.
Over to you, Toby.
I'll confuse you by being an English guy. The conference on Greece talking about Estonia. Maybe try and give it a bit of context. So I worked in the Balkans on economic developments in Serbia, Romania, Macedonia, Croatia back around 2001 to 4. I lived in Estonia on and off for 10 years during its very sharp growth, and then most recently was advising the head of their e-residency program. Can I just, hands up, who knows or has heard of Estonia's e-residency program? Okay, I'll give a bit of context on that. I've also set up a tech startup accelerator in Berlin. I'm working in the tech sector, and I'm writing occasionally a PhD around accelerators, innovation, ecosystems. So an awful lot of what's been said here I should have been writing about. I also helped set up something called Tech North, which was part of Tech City, which was really clustering the north of England together. And I was partly wheeled into that because I wasn't in the north of England, and I'm not from the north of England, and had worked in the Balkans, which the north of England is quite similar to. and was sitting in Berlin at the time, and was asked to come along and sit in meetings and say to people in Leeds, Yorkshire, Manchester, where I'm sitting in Berlin, I can't see you. And I think this is a big thing that I've worked on a bit in the Balkans as well. Southeast Europe has developed a tech ecosystem that is now Southeast Europe, which is part of the part of the European tech ecosystem. But back in the day when I was out there, it was very Balkanized, hence the name. So you'd have Serbia, Croatia, not talking to each other. And I think the problem we had in the north was Manchester and Leeds in particular wanting to be completely different. And wondering why investors weren't coming up from London to Sheffield. And the answer was simple: there's not enough going on in one city, but if you can cluster it all together, and what we did at the very early days of Tech North was find the 10 best startups in the north of England, bring them down to London. That got attention, because that's beginning to get big enough as an ecosystem. So I think a lot of what I've looked at over the years is how ecosystems to come together, become relevant, how they fit into their wider ecosystem and understand that. And again, I think that's reflecting a lot of what's been discussed today. Estonia was very interesting because it's the most successful post-communist country. It's the most successful country in Eastern Europe. It's becoming one of the most successful countries in Europe, and on many measures it's the most successful country in the world. So what I've seen happen there since I first went in 2001 is pretty remarkable. Going back to the point made earlier today about Bulgaria, which is embarrass your government. Estonia is a great way of embarrassing your government, because what Estonia does digitally in government is ahead of most other countries, and it's very reasonable to ask any of our governments why we're not doing it. So what I saw in Estonia was very interesting. The e-residency program was the end of a journey. They've allowed foreigners to sign up for a local digital ID card, a government-issued digital ID card, with which they can set up an Estonian company and a bank account and pay taxes and submit tax returns. So it's actually quite simple. The reason people want to do this is they've created one of the best digital environments for entrepreneurship. So in Estonia, you can now set up a company online in 20 minutes. You don't ever have to go to an office, fill out a form. You can sign all contracts digitally. You can submit your tax returns famously in 2 or 3 minutes. But what's really going on there, and I think it is important, I mean, I was talking to Christina earlier before all of this about Greece, as countries are trying to move forward. Why does that really matter? First of all, when you can set up a company that easily, people set up companies. And for entrepreneurship, for startups, the biggest obstacle is actually setting up and running a business. And working in countries I've had in the Balkans, where you still have to go to a notary, you have to pay a notary, you have to capitalize a company, that is a massive obstacle to innovation. So being able to set a company up online in 20 minutes for almost nothing is very important. The tax return bit is interesting, because if it's very easy to submit your tax return, you are actually more likely to pay tax. The Estonian system actually, as I said, e-residency was the end of a journey. The beginning of the journey was the digital ID card issued in 2001 on the back of the fact that they had broadband internet everywhere. It was a historical fluke. The country became independent and everyone got given a passport effectively on the same day. So they all expired basically on the same day, so they could replace them all with digital ID cards on the same day. So it was an unusual situation. But they built this thing called X-Road, which connects all of government together in the background. So the reason you can submit your tax return in 2 to 3 minutes is if you give the government permission, they draw information out of your company accounts, your bank accounts, and everything else during the year, create a tax return for you, you just sign it digitally and it's done. So you don't have to do that, but you can. And most people in Estonia choose to give the government access to all that information because it makes their life so much easier, but you don't have to do it. So I think there's real validity in challenging our governments why they can't try and do this. The outcome is Estonia now has one of the highest numbers of startups per capita in Europe. I think it's 33 startups per 100,000 people. It also has, if I've got time for one quick thing that I found very interesting in this, because there's a lot to say on this, Skype. I guess you know Skype. And when Skype got sold, a lot of Estonians became very rich. The GDP in Estonia went up on a graph that year. So much money came into the economy. Those people generally went abroad. Some of them went off to the States, went to Silicon Valley, went to Stanford, joined VC funds, came back to Estonia and became the investors and the founders. And most of the successful Estonian startups that you'll read about now are in some way connected to Skype. So it's called the Skype effect. A lot of them are ex-Skype employees. They have Skype money. Estonia's tech ecosystem is very, very connected. So I think the takeaway from all of this is about social capital. It's about everyone agreeing where they're going. And I've given talks in the Balkans around this with the early tech ecosystems. Estonia has a hashtag Estonian Mafia, which was given to them by Silicon Valley after the Twitter mafia. But they all use it. So every time something good happens in the Estonian startup sector, everybody connected to the Estonian startup sector tweets, "This has just happened, hashtag Estonian Mafia." It's become a brand, and it's very, very powerful, it's very coordinated. If you ask anyone in the Estonian startup sector what's going on, they will give you the same answer. They have the same understanding, the same vision. And that then moves into government. So in effect, everyone in that sort of bit of the Estonian ecosystem agrees on where it's going. And I think that's really, it's easy in a small country, but it's really important. And most of the larger cities don't have that in the larger countries. So that idea of digital government, digital economy, government keeping out of the way, and government enabling. So the digital government is an enabler, makes it very easy for people to start and run companies and export. But other than that, it's a very liberal country, so government basically doesn't get in the way, doesn't get involved. And if you talk to Estonian tech people about how government has supported them, they sort of cock their head and look at you like you're a bit weird. And then you say, well, what has government done? And they've gone, well, nothing. It's fantastic. And I think that's the other takeaway, is really analysing that. So I think those are ideas kind of to be discussed, and I'm happy to talk about them with other people later as well.
On Skype, I mean, because London has also, of course, benefited from the Skype effect, in that many of you will know Tech London Advocates, the massive group of, I think, 4,000 founders, entrepreneurs here in London, which is headed by Ross Shaw, who ran Skype for a number of years. So there is something about that company.
The Skype companies, I mean, transfer-wise, the Skype founded companies move here. Yeah. So the other interesting thing about Tallinn tech scene is they know that they can't run international businesses from Tallinn. It's a tiny, tiny economy. Their region, the Nordic-Baltic region, isn't big enough to scale. So it's totally understood there, and this goes back to a lot of what we've been talking about, cities trying to hold on to stuff. They know they've got to be a stepping stone for companies to start there, grow, and then move. So a lot of the engineering teams stay in Estonia. A lot of the founders go back because they like it, because their quality of life is very high, but they end up running international companies out of cities like London and New York and Silicon Valley.
Well, thank you very much for that. Just one question, really, which applies to all of you. You said, Toby, that government staying out of the way is probably the best thing, but in reality, the government has been a great facilitator and enabler because it's allowed for these things to grow. And also, probably, a bit like what you see in a number of Scandinavian countries, there is agreement in terms of the path forward. In other words, there's a sort of strategy that is communicated, perhaps not on paper necessarily, but certainly it's agreed among the various players in the economy. You know, the government, businesses, younger people. So there is a combined sort of aim, which you don't necessarily find in some of the more developed older countries where there's still a huge amount of disagreement, particularly the larger ones. Look what's going on right now in Catalonia, for example. So government is important, and as Beverley was saying earlier, hand-holding actually matters for some of them in the short term. The business support, that what's there, then it moves. That if strategies change, then it can really leave you stranded. And of course, agreement, as you were saying. To really let government run your business, because getting into your bank account, taking money. I mean, we tried it here about perhaps some of the payments coming from people's bank accounts if they owe tax, and there was a huge negative reaction to this. So we have to bear in mind that there are different mentalities across, but government still is quite important. I mean, that was the sort of point. So just ask on this, and then I'll open it up.
Can I just input on that, because I do think I absolutely agree with that, but I do think that often, and I've seen this at the moment working with some officials in Athens, it's support as a service. So often the mentality within government, and I think we've failed on this sometimes in Whitehall. Was the idea we're going to do all the analysis, and then we're going to say, right, we're going to deliver this, and this, and we put it together and we roll it out, and no one ever actually says to the businesses, what do you want and what do you need? And I think that was one of the reasons why the Tech City initiative worked. That Rohan Silva, working for David Cameron at the time, brought in the founders, the entrepreneurs, once a quarter and said, what are the roadblocks? What's getting in the way? What do you need? And it was simple things like, I don't want to sign a 12-month lease because I don't know whether I'll have the funding to pay for it in 12 months. Okay, we'll try and fix the standard lease provisions. It was really being responsive to what the entrepreneurs and the founders were needing. And I do think that often what we're trying to do with the programs we're setting up in Greece is to really think about that audience and the impact that they can have for the audience.
No, indeed. Beverley, I think.
I'd really like to add to Gordon's point, because when in working with the businesses that I've been working with, it was exactly that they felt that they were being asked to get more productive, for example, through our productivity commission. And there was an assumption by the government in the country that we were not net contributors as a region. There was this gap, output gap supposedly, because we were not productive enough. Yet when I come to conferences down here, very few people knew that our exports had grown 60% from the pre-crisis levels, that we were net contributors when it came to our manufacturing contribution to what we were doing. So when you ask the businesses what was it that could really help them, well, it was actually linking together the skills they need with what they're actually planning to invest in the future. There was the connecting of transport with the built environment, with battery technology for the future. And whilst we had supply side investment, it wasn't necessarily linked to the companies and what they actually wanted to see to power the growth for the future. So I think that it's not just standing out of the way, I agree, but there is something about coming together, planning together, and asking the businesses, demand-led in fact. They talked about principles for growth, demand-led approach, joining the clusters together, linking up the provision of the services that would support the growth.
But what we also heard, of course, another bit of this ecosystem is what we heard from Diana Voutirakou earlier in her brilliant presentation, that actually a lot of that push of what we want and what we should be doing may come further down from the students, from the younger population.
Yes.
And quite a lot of businesses may not even have realized that that's really what they need. So, Sonia, you're going to come in.
Yes, just it's interesting because I think on the France point of view, I mean, France is very well known as it's been for a very, very long time as a very centralized state country where everything was happening in Paris, and state had a huge role. What Emmanuel Macron has been trying to, or is trying to break or change in France, agree or not, but he's clearly trying to change that mentality, and he did it during the campaign. That was very interesting to see who he went to see, because he did campaign, but he didn't campaign exactly the same way as every other candidate did campaign, with big meetings in different strategic areas. He went quite early on in his campaign, actually even before he declared that he was going to run. He went to meet quite a lot of entrepreneurs and very young startup dynamic, and exactly what you were saying, asking them, what do you need, what are you expecting, and everything. So I think that was part of his reflection for what he was going to offer or try to do in France afterwards, and trying to do now with some labor markets reforms, and which encounter quite a lot of resistance, but he's nevertheless doing them. But then to go back to the idea of, does the government needs to intervene or not, or do we need that as an entrepreneur? If I go back to the Lille case, there was one thing I didn't mention in my little presentation, was about the EMA, so the European Medicine Agency. Mm-hmm. Again, I'm sorry, you're going to think I'm obsessed, but I'm going to talk about Brexit. So it's based in London. It is now leaving London for obvious reasons. And there are 18 cities who are candidates to have the EMA, which is 900 personal researchers plus hundreds of other coming regularly to contribute to. So it's quite a huge thing, and Lille has done all it could do. What they explained to me in terms of showing that it's a huge hub in research and science, huge hub in health. Already one of the, or I think the biggest hub in health system in France. So they did all that, and they said, well, now we've done everything, and now we need the state and the president basically to now put his weight behind it, because it's the last hurdle to maybe get it. I don't think they will get it, but anyway. So
Well, yes. Let's hope it stays here, and
It
that
won't.
we never leave
it
the
will
EU.
never.
Yes.
Well, no.
Oh well, I know it won't. But it's interesting what you said about France being quite centralised, because of course we think that about the UK, and the reality is that you do have quite big cities in France, which can rival Paris up to a point, and really serious regional cities that are sort of capitals of the region. Whereas we don't really. I mean, the difference in size is enormous between us and the second largest city. I mean, that's in London. So, but in Greece, I mean, it's very interesting to think about the various hubs that might develop. So there's Athens, of course, but there's Thessaloniki with its own thing. And then there are a number of other cities which could develop on the start-up and innovation scale that we should be considering.
I think on the Tech North example, the crucial thing is that they don't compete with each other.
Yes.
And this is what I've seen in the Balkans and the north of England, but you don't see somewhere like the Baltics, is when that happens, they have to figure out how they form one ecosystem. They might specialize in different things, but they have to be together. And I think that goes to a point in your talk about Brad Feld's book, which is still really important for this whole discussion. You lead by example. So the entrepreneurs have to get together, have to be united, and have to demonstrate where they're of value. And Estonia was very lucky because it had Skype. It was very hard for the government not to do what they were asked to do after Skype did that to the GDP. And picking up on a point of yours earlier, digital government in Estonia saves 2% of GDP. Estonia pays 2% of GDP to get NATO protection from Russia. So there's a very, very, very clear business case as to why people should file their taxes on time. And they know that, and it's explained. So I think, addressing the question here, the entrepreneurs, the students, that whole ecosystem, that they shouldn't wait to be led, they shouldn't wait for the government to create structures for them. They need to get ahead and demonstrate why they're valuable. And then I think the government follows, and that's where government becomes an enabler. It goes back to your point, what do you need us to change so you can keep doing this more and better?
Okay, but I mean, a tax regime matters though.
Of course, exactly, that's the government enabling.
Okay, I just need to check indeed, because I know Yanis Palalos is chairing the next session. Can I just check that we have longer? Did you put a little note? We have another 4 minutes left. So it's not 12:45 as I thought was the case. It's now 5 minutes.
So please wrap up. 5 minutes.
Right, 5 minutes. Okay. Right. I'm going to take a number of questions, assuming there are any, quickly, and then bring it to the panel. Questions of relevance to Greece in particular? Yes.
I'll speak now. Yeah, I think the very brief point of Greece, that progress in the digital domain is driven through conflict, not through consensus. Because there's a clear divide in Greece. The technologists and the politicians who are pro-reform are against those who are in favor of maintaining the status quo. And the status quo is based on non-transparency. The digital, anything that has to do with digital is premised on transparency. So when you look at progress in Greece, you have to look at conflict, not at consensus. You have to look at how conflict plays out. Thank you.
Yes, well, just to complicate matters then. So, anyone else? Yes, please, just shout.
Yes.
Oh, there is a microphone. Thank you.
My name is Thomas Papanikolaou. My question is, what Estonia has done, you mentioned that it's a small country, but with digital, is there such a thing as a small country to replicate? Because I would love to have 2 minutes to set up my identity or to set up a company. Why is it only applicable to small countries?
Well, I mean, there have been some interesting innovations in the digital era in Greece as well, of course, that very big companies are interested in.
The first answer is, I once asked the Estonian president why Estonia is so digital. He said, when we became a nation has to have all these different bits of a country, police force, etc. We didn't have enough people, so we had to go digital from the very beginning.
Right.
Plus also they had nothing, so they had the chance to go digital without any of the sort of baggage. And moving forward, I think it's just very helpful that it's small. I mean, all the people behind Digital Estonia, it's probably 10 or 20 people. They all live in the same area, pretty well went to the same school. Friends of mine would say, well, I go running with the Prime Minister every morning, I'll ask him. It's very small and informal, which does make it easier.
Yeah.
So this conflict issue that was raised here, if you have that conflict, does it make it much more difficult?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing that rings true about Estonia is it actually doesn't matter who's in government. Basically, where Estonia is going always stays the same, and that does help. So you can have your political conflicts playing out in the background, they don't really affect the main direction of the country.
Okay. Any other points? Yes, please. And there. Yeah. I'll take two together, one and then the other one.
Hello. Just about that. I'm curious about the corruption rate in Estonia. I'm from Turkey. I would not trust my government with any information I have other than probably my social media.
Very good point, is what I'm saying. I said before that you have to be prepared to let them intervene in your life to such an extent, including taking money out of your bank account. Yes, corruption. Was that it? Have you finished your...
No, I was just curious about that.
Yeah, okay. There's one more point up there. And then we'll try and take those and then we'll stop. Since it's now 3 minutes, we're doing really well.
So the point comes back to stakeholders again. You've mentioned Estonia. I'm gonna touch on this point again. You've mentioned that there wasn't initially a lot of personnel involved in institution building, in creating government institutions. Considering that Greece has a lot of personnel in public service, and considering the qualities of that personnel, and considering that they have a specific stake in running government, would you say that the country is doomed for the forthcoming future?
Right. Well, we have now a red light there, but we'll
at least as far as digital government is concerned.
So I'm afraid it's you, Toby. But if the others can just add something to those two questions: corruption and how can you get anything through having so many civil servants who maybe fight with each other or whatever. So I think perhaps I'll ask Toby to answer the Estonian thing really quickly. Corruption.
Estonia is technically not very corrupt, at least for an Eastern European country. Digitising government, pretty well everything is online. Cabinet meetings are online, all government accounts are online. Makes corruption much, much, much harder. And then the personnel thing, I mean, I'm off the top of my head, digitising government reduces the number of people you need in government, but if by contrast it helps the economy grow, they move into the private sector.
Yeah. Beverley, anything
Yeah,
to add?
I think all I'd like to add is that for us as a very centralised economy, for example, Birmingham retains 7% of the tax income raised in Birmingham, so even more centralised than France. I think actually digitising government is really critical because the voice of residents and businesses can be heard, and that is the powerful lobby for change, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah. Sonia, anything to add to that?
Well, I agree.
You agree?
No, I agree. And I think in terms of the corruption, what you are saying, clearly the size matters. And that's why maybe as well the question about going back to the theme of cities
Small countries.
interacting, because cities could be compared to a small country. And then if between cities you interact, then maybe even in Turkey it might help actually.
So maybe you need lots more smaller units. Maybe the
I think so.
Catalonians are listening to us right now. So, and Gordon, anything to add?
I mean, I think on that last point, the role of cities, we at Bloomberg focus on cities, we don't focus on nations. We build relationships with strong mayors who have a real vision. We turn down the vast majority of cities that come to us and ask us for assistance. So I do think, while I don't have a solution for the number of civil servants, I do think finding the right partners, being a good partner, which means giving before you get, and finding those partners and typically having a public-private partnership as part of the solution is really important.
Well, thank you very much. Can you join me in thanking Gordon, Toby, Beverley and Sonia, who gave up the time to present to us today. And I think we learned quite a lot about the international experience, and let's hope it's useful for all the Greeks here and all of us, really. Thank you very much. You can just join me.